Hi, welcome back to Gen Z Bible class. We've been in Genesis chapter 12, and we just began looking at the story of a man called Abram. Perhaps you know him as Abraham. His name gets changed a little bit later in the story, but I have to try to remember while we're in this part of the story to call him Abram, because that's his name. And we talked a little bit about him, and if you didn't hear that part last week, just a little recap. We meet him first of all in the land of Ur. Now, Israel is up here, and this is of course thousands of years ago, down south of Israel. And his father, Abram's father, decides that he's going to pack up his whole family and move them up to the land of Canaan. And that was, no small task, because this was a large group of people. I have to remember that back in that day, in the culture back then, people kind of lived together in these family groups. Almost, maybe you'd think of them more as a tribe than a nation. And this was the situation with Abram as he was growing up with his two brothers. We learned that one of his brothers dies when he's younger, and Abram kind of takes his brother's son under his wing, and so Lot is Abram's nephew, and he takes him along with him on this trip, along with his father. As they head north towards the land of Canaan, they make a little stop at a place called Haran. And it was here where we're not really quite sure why, but the whole entourage sort of settles in there for some time, like a little detour on the trip or rest stop. But I think it was more than just a few days. I think it might have been a number of years that they spent there. We don't know exactly why, but we do know that two things happen in Haran. One is that Abram's father dies. Maybe that's the reason they didn't go on, because his father was getting too old to travel. We don't really know. But the other thing that we know happened while they were in Haran is they actually did pretty well there, and they were very successful, and they accumulated a lot more wealth than they had. So I guess it was a good thing. We talked about how, when we live our lives, and occasionally God seems to put us in one of these little rest stops, and we don't know quite what he's doing. But he usually has a purpose for us being there. So God gets to the point where he's patient, I guess you could say. But when Abram's father dies, he sort of taps him on the shoulder again and says, okay, remember where you were headed, and it's time for you to continue your journey. And of course now Abram has all of his father's possessions, plus the things that they picked up while they were there in Haran, and he heads up towards Canaan, north towards Canaan. And as we left him last time, he finally arrives there, and he's so thankful to God for bringing him that far. He makes an altar, and God gives him this wonderful promise. And remember, we were talking about covenants in the Bible, that every once in a while God makes a promise to someone. And of course, when God makes a promise, he always keeps his promise. And he promised Abraham that from him, from his seed, would come a great nation, and that through him the whole earth would be blessed. And of course, we know, because we live on this side of history, how that all worked out and how those promises indeed did come true. So now we're going to pick up where we left off. And by this time, Abram is living in the land of Canaan. And I think we would have to assume that he's been there for at least a few years, because it takes a while to get settled. You don't just go to the grocery store and buy food. You've got to grow your own stuff. So whatever farming they needed to do to get established, and they had all these animals that they had to take care of. And of course Abraham has his family, plus he has all these servants, and it must have been really quite an interesting lifestyle. Of course, they were a nomadic people. So maybe in a way they were living in tents. They weren't building houses. So maybe it wasn't as difficult as it would be for us if we had to do something like that. Go on a big camping trip with everything that we own. Well, anyway, this is where we are as we begin the next part of the story, which is some kind of interesting things going on here. So let's start by reading verse 10 of chapter 12 in Genesis. Now, there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while, because the famine was severe. What's this all about? I mean, doesn't it seem that if God wanted Abram to be in Canaan, God's the one in charge of the weather, right? So why would he allow this famine to occur and make it so that Abraham had to leave everything behind and go down to Egypt? And that's kind of an interesting question. But this is not the only time in the Bible that something like this happens, and God uses famine to, I guess you could say, get his will done. And there's a few other stories in the Bible. One of them, I think maybe one of the most well-known, is when Abram's grandson, when they experience a famine once again in the land of Canaan, they are once again forced to go to Egypt. And this was God's way of planting this extended family of Abraham back in Egypt. And we'll get into that eventually. There's a whole story behind that. It seems to be God's way of directing people's lives from time to time. And as we think about our own lives and some of these principles that we see here, I think we can say that occasionally God will bring something into our life that we don't quite understand. But there's almost always, and you don't always see it immediately, but there's almost always a reason why he lets these things happen. And we're going to find out here that this particular famine sort of plays into God's plan for Abraham and his descendants. So this is the situation. They got to move to Egypt. But there's some problems here. And Abram comes up with a plan. And this is his plan. Verses 11 to 13. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know what a beautiful woman you are, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." Now, when you read that, you think, what kind of person is Abram anyway, that he would, allow his wife to be taken by Pharaoh, and he's kind of using her as a decoy so that he doesn't get killed? Well, I guess you could look at it that way, but if you really appreciate the situation that Abram was in, you'll come to understand that in a way, he really didn't have a choice. Number one, there was no choice about going to Egypt. It wasn't like, well, I will or I won't. He had to. If he didn't go to Egypt, everyone would have died. There was no grocery store that you could go to buy food. If your crops failed, you were going to die. And you had all these animals to take care of, and they were going to die. So there was really no option for Abram, and in order to save his family. And we have to remember, this was a patriarchal society, and what the man said, what the father said, was the rule. There wasn't really a background of, government intervention in anyone's lives. So they were dependent on leadership within their own families. And that's why we call it a patriarchal society, that the father was the head of the home. And in this case, Abram was the head of not just his own immediate family, but of all of these other people that depended on him for their lives. He was definitely playing a role of leadership. And so the decisions that he had to make affected all of these people. And I think we really need to appreciate that. The other thing we need to appreciate that in that culture and at that time, this whole thing about Pharaoh taking his wife seems so crazy, but that's the way it was back then. And we're going to find out that what Abraham, was afraid would happen actually did happen. And so he has to make this decision. I guess if Abraham had done one thing wrong, it might have been that he comes up with this plan. And, sometimes we like to step in and make plans for our own lives that aren't necessarily in line with God's plans. We try to do things ourselves. And I think there's a real lesson in this, that this was Abraham's way to save himself. And if he had trusted God, we'll never know really what would have happened if he had simply trusted God and, not taken this route. But we do know how the story ends, so we'll be getting to that. Anyway, so he has this plan, and he follows through with this plan. And let's see what happens next in verses 14 to 16. When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman, and when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle and male and female donkeys, male and female servants and camels. So everything that Abram was afraid would happen did happen. But I don't know if he would have expected that he would have become even more wealthy through this whole situation, but that's what happens. And, you can almost imagine that this whole group of people come down from the north, and I would imagine that probably there were a lot of people heading to Egypt for the same reason that Abram did. And but this whole entourage with Abraham and his family and all his servants and everything he owned would have drawn a lot of attention, and there was just no way he could humbly hide from the Pharaoh and his officials. So they see what's going on, they take a look at Sarai, and they find out this is a very beautiful woman. Just a little side lesson here. I guess everyone wants to be beautiful. Well, guys want to be handsome. Women want to be beautiful. And it's a very important thing. But, probably law of averages is that there are a limited number of people that are so beautiful, like Sarai must have been, that they would draw this kind of attention. So you think, well, every person, every guy would love to have a wife that is so beautiful, but in this case, it kind of works out to be a bit of a problem. And I think we can see why. She draws so much attention. And of course, Abram follows through with his little lie and his deception and tells them she's my sister. And in reality, she was his half-sister. We learned that a little bit later in the book. So it wasn't a complete lie. But it certainly wasn't the truth. And a half-truth is, I guess you could say, the same thing as a lie. But in the meantime, he's putting a lot of money in his pocket. It's just kind of a crazy circumstance here. So how does this, what happens next? Well, okay, let's see what happens next. In verses 17 to 19, but the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. "What have you done to me?" he said. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? And why did you say she was my sister so that I took her to be my wife?" So now all these plagues are falling upon. We don't know specifically what they were, but all these bad things are happening to Pharaoh. And it's interesting that he puts two and two together somehow, and he realizes it's because of this woman that I took, and as a result, all these bad things are happening. We don't know specifically what they were, but some bad things were happening. And this kind of reminds us, when we think back to that promise that God made Abram, this covenant that God made to Abram, and one of the things he said, and this is in chapter 12, verse 3, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And so God is really being faithful to the promise that he made to Abram, so that when Pharaoh is trying to do something that is wrong and something that was not, actually would have messed up God's plan, because Sarai ends up playing a very important role in the line of the Messiah, because she is a part of that line that leads to the coming Messiah. So it's kind of interesting. So this promise is fulfilled, and God curses Pharaoh and his household, and the whole story ends, the last part of 19 and verse 20. Now then, here is your wife, take her and go. And then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. So this is kind of how the story ends. I mean, it's interesting, but it's kind of a bizarre little story, but it sort of has a happy ending, because Abram is able to leave a richer man than he was. And so now you're thinking, well, this famine, if he had stayed up there, he probably would have lost everything. But it didn't seem like, going to Egypt would be a prosperous type experience. But it turns out that it was. And I think this is just God working and God providing for Abram, as he was commissioned to build this family and to build this nation that God promised would happen. So there's something that's really interesting about this, and we'll kind of wrap it up by thinking about this. There's a lot of parallels between what happens in this story and what is going to happen like 400 plus years later, when Israel finds themselves in pretty much the same situation. And some of the similarities. Well, in this case, Abram goes to Egypt because of a famine. And later on, Israel, or Abram's descendants, this is going to be a couple of generations down the line, find themselves in exactly the same situation. There's a famine, and they have to go to Egypt. And this is where you get into the story of Joseph, and you're going to love that story. It's a whole nother deal. But they find themselves in the land of Egypt, and they end up being there for 400 years, but it's because of the famine. And then when it's time for, when they arrive in Egypt, they are well accepted. And because Joseph, their descendant, was a hero in Egypt. He basically saved all of Egypt and, everybody in that part of the world, because there was an even greater famine in Egypt itself at that time. So Joseph is a hero, and when his family comes, they become heroes, and they're greatly honored. But after 400 years, things change, and people forget this whole story, and now they are ready to say goodbye to, the Israelites. And in the same way, God brings about curses, many curses. If you know the story of Exodus, the exodus of the people of Israel from Egypt, you know about the plagues that God sends on them. So there's another similarity. And then finally, when the Israelites leave Egypt that second time, they are also loaded down with treasure, because all the people in Egypt wanted them to go. They said, here, just take our stuff and get out of here, because of all these plagues that were falling upon them. So it's just kind of interesting to see these patterns in history, and how in a way history repeats itself. But the one thing that's constant between all of these stories is that it's God moving his people in the direction that he wants them to go. And he uses all kinds of things to do that. And sometimes he'll use something like a famine. So I guess what we can conclude, what we can think about in terms of God's character and how he works, is that we have a direction. I think, I would encourage everyone to really think and pray about what it is that God wants to do with you in your life. Now, in the case of Abram, he was calling him to go to Canaan to build a new nation, and God accomplished his will in that command. But he wants to accomplish something in each one of our lives, and he calls each one of us to do something specifically. And, just like Abram heard God's command and he responded to it and walked in obedience, that's a great lesson for all of us. But also to expect these times of difficulty. And the verse I'm going to end with is one that we find in Romans chapter 3. And Paul is writing to the church in Rome, and really that they were pretty well versed in bad experiences themselves. The whole period of the early church, people were being persecuted and put in jail, and it was not easy to be a Christian then. And they went through all kinds of suffering. And Paul is encouraging them, and he says this to them. And this is in Romans chapter 5, verses 3 and 4. But we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. And so you see these sufferings that Paul was talking about built character in the Christians. And it was really a way in which they could demonstrate the love and the character of Christ in their lives. It's kind of like, I don't know, my grandson is playing soccer now, and they're kind of young compared to the other kids that are playing, and so a lot of times they don't do so well. But I told him that, you're much better off, because you're going to learn a whole lot more when you play against teams that, are going to cause you trouble. You're going to become a better player and a better person by that kind of testing. And this is a principle that is always true. When we go through times of testing, God builds things in our character and in our lives that can be a great blessing later on. And they can be a great blessing to other people who go through those same kinds of experiences. So, well, this was a very interesting story, and Abram's life is like really interesting, and there's these stories that are to follow, and how God carries out his promise with Abram to make from him a great nation. And that's what we're going to be looking at in the days to come. And in the next session, we'll follow along and see what happens next in the life of Abram. And I hope you're able to join us then next time on Gen Z Bible Class.